Hey everyone, welcome back to another video. In today's one, I want to answer some of my viewers' questions. These are collected from both YouTube community posts, Instagram questions, and comments in general that I get. There will be some that are more direct questions to me personally, and then some more general animation industry related questions as well. I will have them show up here on screen while I answer them. And I will also run a video of me laying out a bunch of keyframes of characters for my animation, so that you have some visual interest while I chat. So let's start right away with the first question, and this one is more directed to me personally. Do you have a career as an animator? And if so, do you work at an animation studio or are you freelance? Or is YouTube your main gig? Well, I am a freelance animator. I've been working for over 10 years in the advertisement industry, so it's mostly been commercials, social media contents for brands, web campaigns, and a few game projects too. The work you see me do here on YouTube is not always what I get hired for. Some projects have been in line with that, but a lot of it is more sort of motion graphics related. So YouTube is not my main gig, but it's definitely something I'm focusing more of my effort towards as it's growing. What's your best advice for beginners that want to venture into the world of animation? I think as with most things, it's important to approach it with a lot of curiosity from the start. Make sure that the process of learning is something that you find fun and interesting. Create yourself a few personal projects maybe that you can use as a way of learning. I can work for hours at end when I'm motivated and inspired to figure something out. So make sure that you are excited about what you're learning and making, and you will learn things quickly. Don't treat it as like pure studies or worry about what's the right or wrong way of doing things. As you get better, you find what works for you and what's not so good for you. When did you decide to go freelance, and what do you love and hate about solo work? I worked as a full-time employee for around 4 years in a creative agency in London at the beginning of my career, and then decided to go freelance after that, mainly because I saw a lot of my friends and colleagues doing that, and they encouraged me to do the same. I think having those first years in a company helped me to learn how things worked and gave me a bunch of contacts and friends working in the same field. When then going freelance, that made things a bit easier as I was recommended by others and got work pretty much straight from the beginning of my freelance journey. At that point, I did not have much of a social media presence, so that was something I started around that same time. But this YouTube channel wasn't something I worked on until several years later. What I love about solo work is that I am my own boss. I can decide whenever I want to be off or where I work. Going freelance gave me the freedom to live where I wanted. So I moved from London down to Innsbruck a few years back, which I'm super happy that I did. I don't really hate anything about solo work. What I don't have is colleagues in the same way that I had when I worked in the studio. My main client base is still London based, so from Austria I don't physically show up in any offices and meet people I work with in that same way, which I think for some people can be challenging. I'm pretty alright with that, and I make sure to stay social outside of work instead. But I'm mainly positive about solo work, and I find that it fits well for me. It also gives me the time to focus on this YouTube channel and other branches of my career. How do you approach client work when in doubt about the difficulties and length of the project? I think this is all about communication with the client you have here. If you take on a project, make sure that you go over the expectations, timeline, and requirements of the project with your client. Different clients will have more or less knowledge about the process and the time it takes to make things, so sometimes it's on you to tell them, and sometimes they might come with the numbers. But I would not put myself in a situation where I'm uncertain that I can deliver what they're asking for. I would also properly figure out what time I think it will take me in case they have a different expectation. Some smaller clients might not have a full understanding of the work that you do, so it's important to find an agreement on time and so on early in the project. No client, will be happy with you not being confident that you can't finish what they're after. How often do you practice? How do you prioritize dedicated study versus working on projects? I see working on my projects as practice. For me, there's no time or point really in making things I cannot use, so I would always suggest turning any practice into a project. Even if it's just a short thing, I use this YouTube channel and my Patreon page as ways for me to practice and getting better and sharing what I learn with you guys here. How do you make an impressive demo reel for getting hired in the animation industry? The demo reel will be completely dependent on the work you put into it. I think taking your best work and putting them in sequence in a nice way, it's all that it takes. The work should speak for it, not really the edit of your reel. Of course, making it nice and snappy and interesting is useful, but good content that is in line with what you want to be hired for is what's important. Here comes a big one. Why don't you use Blender? And this is probably one of the most common questions I get asked. I started learning 3D back in around 2012, I think, and we had Cinema 4D in the studio that I worked for. It was also the go-to software at the time for anything motion graphics related, and it kind of still is, at least in the circle that I work in. Now when softwares like Blender is free and getting really powerful, I totally see more people gravitating towards it. Especially the people starting out now have a huge advantage by having such a good tool available for free. And I'm sure we will see a massive increase in the number of people doing good work at a quite young age. For me, I use Cinema 4D purely because I know it well and I find that it works great for what I want to make. Swapping softwares for me requires something kind of groundbreaking to have happened where the ones I'm using might not keep up or so on. Of course, it comes at a cost, as Cinema 4D is quite a pricey software, but as I need it for my commercial work, it's just part of my budget now. I think Blender is a fantastic software and we see so much good work come out of the community of people using it. It might eventually be what I use as well, but for now I don't really feel like I have a need to swap. So the next one is kind of straight from a person's perspective here. I'm doing engineering now, but I've started to develop a passion for animation. Do you think it's possible to get into an animation career when I'm 30 or so? So I think this will apply to anyone, not just engineers, but I definitely think that you can get into an animation career after 30. It really is just how much time you are willing to spend on something. Obviously, when we are younger, we have a lot more time to explore things, when studying perhaps or so on. But if you're dedicated, you can start animating at any age. It's not competitive gymnastics or something like that that requires a peak age performance. We are just pushing pixels around. What's your go-to method when it comes to sound? You record your own voice in dialogue, at least as a placeholder, but do you have any specific resources you use for music or sound effects? Yeah, when it comes to dialogue for my personal projects, I'm kind of experimenting a bit. I have not worked with voice actors really, so currently I've done a rough pass using my own voice and might later find the right actors or people to replace those lines. I think if my production was a bit less modular and changing, I would have started with the voices, but currently I'm still making changes to what they say kind of mid-production, so I think this is a better way to do it. Regarding music, I've been fortunate to have talented friends in that area. My good friend Ryan Dersak made the music for my short film Sensations, and his brother Luke did the music for my earlier work. Making the music for my own films is something I would love to do at some point, but when you have talented friends, it makes things quite easy. For sound effects, I try to record as much as I can myself. Any advice for continuous flow of work that inspires you to continue? Well, I think this is all about mindset. I've made a full video about motivation and productivity that I will link to here. But in a nutshell, I think one can actively try to stay motivated and inspired. It shouldn't be something we wait for to happen, but we have to actually work for it to be around. Don't stare at your blank Photoshop canvas or empty 3D scene. Seek out motivation by whatever makes sense to you. Like going for long walks on my own or sitting in a coffee shop without my phone and only allowing myself to sort of figure out what I need to do helps me sometimes. It's basically active daydreaming where you try to channel your inspiration. But yeah, watch that video if you want a bit more in-depth view about my thoughts on that subject. Is animation a good source of income? Animation in general is a very broad field, and there are many industries working in that format. Depending on, I guess, location and demand, I think this can vary quite a lot in terms of income. I only know my small part of the cake, which is more advertisement based, and there's definitely a lot of work around, I could say that. And you can for sure make a good living from animation. Maybe by having a broad skill set that blends over a bit more into motion design and not just traditional 2D animation, for example, can be useful to find jobs. But if you're good at what you do and you know how to market yourself well, then I think there's a lot of work around. I'm not so familiar with the whole TV and film animation industry, so I won't say too much about that. I believe it might be a bit more competitive though. What to do if you feel unhappy about your animations? I think it's part of the process to not always be satisfied with our own work. We are our own biggest critics, so don't stress too much about it. It's so easy to always compare yourself to others, but I think it's important to find what works with your animations rather than what doesn't. A healthy dose of self-criticism is of course good to see what to improve on, but by making something you have already achieved a great deal more than not having made anything. So just keep creating. Do your parents watch your videos? I think maybe they've seen a few videos, yes. I think they've definitely seen my short films, so that I know. How long have you worked on your busiest workday? My busiest workday probably turned into the next day. When I worked in the studio in London, I had a few occasions where we needed to prepare a bunch of stuff for pitches under very time-limited circumstances, and that often meant hardcore crunch work. I did sleep a few hours on the office kitchen sofa a few times, but that's nothing I would recommend. That was during the first few dog years, I would say, and now I just wouldn't accept that kind of timeline. Also, I don't think anyone should be required to do so either. So here's another question. I feel that a big part of animation is drawing. Why isn't every drawing artist an animator? I think it's definitely something illustrators should try. For traditional 2D animation, drawing skills are necessary, and animation has its own technical difficulties, of course, but that shouldn't stop people from trying it. It can also be a great way to practice for drawing. So I think, yeah, more people should probably try it. What's your views on using references on an animation? I think references is very useful. I use it all the time. I think a lot of people confuse reference with being something undesired and frowned upon, as if it's copying. One shouldn't copy anyone else's work and claim that it's your own, but if you can film or photograph your own references, there is nothing wrong with that. Also, referencing from real life is a huge part of building a visual library and creating something believable in your films. Even gathering bits that work from other people's art and tastefully integrate that into your own work is not forbidden. We all iterate on each other's stuff anyway. It's hard to be completely original. So I think one can use as much reference as they want, as long as it's their own or they're kind of allowed to use it and not copying someone else's work. When will your current film be released? That I don't really know, and that's kind of the beauty of personal projects. It doesn't have a specific deadline, and I can just work on it and enjoy the process. I am progressing, at least, so it's not going backwards, that much I can say. Okay, I think that's a good amount of questions for this time. Hope you enjoyed this and found this useful. Comment if you want to expand on any of these answers. Maybe you have some personal opinions about them. And also keep asking questions. I enjoy answering in the comments. Stay tuned for more videos. Join me on Patreon for more tutorials. Be a darling and subscribe to the channel here on YouTube, and I'll see you guys soon.